Been almost exactly a year since India took the presidency of G20. Obviously a historic weekend, this one, unforgettable in many accounts when it comes to the whole global leadership descending upon India. In fact, yesterday we had Prime Minister Narendra Modi in conversation with US President Joe Biden. And we believe that some breakthroughs have been made, especially on the long disputed, long-standing pending issue on the WTO trade talks, and this one coming on account of finally that dispute settling in, on the poultry products produced. So that is, of course, something that India and US have finally been able to advance their discussions on and have arrived at a breakthrough. But I think most interestingly, it's this entire artificial intelligence and semiconductor pact which India and US are looking at closely partnering on. And let's look at the statements that have come from NVIDIA, partnering with Reliance Jio as well as with Tata Communications, and really trying to build this AI infrastructure in India, which...
It's interesting, the timing of it is interesting. We know that this is a precursor to what's going to be more extensive talks between the two countries. Also, perhaps after that important India's Prime Minister's visit to the US, where some announcements were made, some money was promised, some technology transfer was promised. All of them looks like it's coming to some fruition.
Absolutely, Shweta. So I think some sort of conclusion there on the kind of investments that were committed by Micron and by Allied Microchips back in Applied Materials, I beg your pardon, back in June when Prime Minister Modi was visiting US. Now, those investments are taking shape. Add to that, NVIDIA making this commitment to build the AI infrastructure in India, which is going to translate across the broad AI cloud development, AI servers, data centers, all of that coming in. And of course, big statements coming even on investments when it comes to other US-based semiconductor companies. In fact, two of them committing to invest as much as $300 million and $400 million each to further bolster this whole AI push. And you mentioned timing. I think the timing is really critical given China's absence. And we've seen the kind of, Cold War between China and US when it comes to this hot subject of semiconductors.
Absolutely.
And neither wanting to share their technologies or their investments, bilaterally. And it gains even more prominence given the fact that US heads for elections next year. And we know with the advent of deep fakes and with the advancement of of these great semiconductors, how deep fakes could be something that that the world can latch on to, and how misinformation can be spread. So it is squarely in China's interest to not let the Democrats come back to power next year, and it is in India's interest to try and see how the Democrats stay in power next year, because if tables were to turn next year in the US, I think the impact on China would be extremely positive, and the impact on India not as much.
Right. So it is in India's interest, of course, to ensure that there is a continuity in leadership in the US. But all of that, of course, conversation happening on the back of that G20, the mega G20 summit that India has been preparing for, a host of meetings of finance ministers, of central bank governors, working groups, and all of this culminates into one big meeting of G20 leaders. All of them have flown in from different parts of the world. Yesterday, as we were on the show at about 8 o'clock, Rishi Sunak was in India. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau had arrived, Japanese PM had arrived, and a host of leaders continue to arrive as of today. But let's also quickly take a look at what's on the agenda. I'll run our viewers through what to expect in a couple of minutes from now. Now, Prime Minister was, of course, expected to arrive at Bharat Mandapam at 9:20. He's arrived about 20 minutes prior to the schedule. At 10:30, the first session, which is One Earth, will begin. Remember, there are 3 sessions. So, One Earth, One Family, and One Future. All throughout today and tomorrow, 3 sessions will bring together leaders from different parts of the world, and there'll be series of deliberations, discussions. There will be a window for meetings between 1:30 to 3 p.m. Session 2, which is One Family, starts at about 3 o'clock. At 4:45, there'll be a fresh window for meetings, and at 7 p.m. there is a gala dinner hosted by the President of India, Draupadi Murmu. All of that, of course, it's going to be a very action-packed action-packed day, Krishna.
Right, the right way of putting it is this is the great geopolitical song and dance. That's what these summits are all about, because just how important song and dance are for Bollywood films and Indian films. These things, albeit not actually moving the actual story forward, are yet very, very important in the larger scheme of things. And the fact that India is hosting the G20 presidency, you were talking about the Bharata Mandapam. It is just being made for, just before this G20 came about. I'm thinking 20 years down the line, when you look at the Bharata Mandapam and you look at the fact that that beginning was made today by inviting the entire world to the Bharata Mandapam, it will stand out. This day, this moment will stand out 20 years from now, when India would have become even greater, probably the most dominant global superpower. It's the way hopes are, fingers crossed. But that beginning would be made today. Let's be honest about what the G20 is. G20 is a lot about the face that you put up to the world and the conversations that you start. A lot of talk about the final communique. Last time at the G20 summit, the final common communique, the final statement took 3 days. There was no consensus. Ukraine war is going on. There is no Russia. There is no China. Yes, these kind of problems will happen in any global platform, any global fora, forever. There's going to be conflict in the world, and these summits...
You can't build consensus with as diverse a group as a G20.
Yes, the thing is that the consensus will be eventually reached in bilateral talks post these G20 summits. So, and if you see what's happening, Biden coming to India, having that meeting with Modi ji, and talking about all the important things that Karthik spoke about, semiconductor, defense, and the UNSC seat. That conversation, bear in mind, begins in G20. Nothing might be achieved with this G20 summit, but that conversation will continue eventually with Biden and with the US when we want to discuss trade with them. So then trade and defense will become two important bargaining points for India to get something out of when we do that bilateral. Just talking about Biden came to India. He had a bilateral meeting with Modi ji, and unlike usual bilateral meetings, this one takes place in Modi ji's house.
Okay.
And apparently, the White House is complaining that some of their journalists who came with the entourage of Biden weren't given access to this particular meeting between Biden and Prime Minister Modi at Prime Minister Modi's residence. Why residence when there's a G20 summit happening?
Okay.
So, you have to read between the lines when it comes to G20 summits. Yes, the larger skepticism about the fact that almost nothing gets actually achieved in the summit remains, but I'm hopeful that conversations begin. If UNSC seat is achieved for India in a year's time from now, and the conversations begin today, serious negotiations begin today, I'd be happy. I'd be hopeful.
I think, the way I see it, it is essentially, if nothing substantial is achieved on paper, if there are no bilateral talks resulting in bilateral trade agreements, there's at least going to be India asserting its soft power at a global stage. And, yesterday, I think Rakesh Khar was here on the show and he said something interesting, and it stayed with me. About 10 years ago, it was about taking India to the world. Now it's about bringing world to India, which has been achieved, albeit a lot of challenges here that we want to discuss. But let's also quickly first talk about that bilateral meeting that happened between Joe Biden and Indian Prime Minister. What all was discussed? What's in the making? Could there be a possibility of a free trade agreement?
So, I don't know. I think, free trade agreement is something which may or may not come through. In fact, Rishi Sunak, Prime Minister of UK, yesterday issued the statement saying that free trade agreement between UK and India is not happening right now, at least not at the G20
At least won't
summit,
be rushed
right?
at.
It won't be rushed at. And I think every country will have to look at their own inherent national interests before going ahead and hurriedly signing any sort of a free trade agreement. Now, I think coming to what are the headlines emerging from the meeting between President Joe Biden and Prime Minister Modi yesterday? Krishna mentioned, I think the number one headline item there is that the US is going to back India to arrive at that permanent seat at the UN Security Council. Now, again, US unilaterally supporting India does not cut it, especially at a summit which does not have the Chinese Premier Xi Jinping in attendance.
Which opposes India's
stand, right? Which completely opposes India's stand. I think it is also important to note that US and the West in general has not been very happy with India trying to, find this way around the US imposed sanctions on Russia and continuing to import Russian oil. But given the fact that India is the host country, given the sort of, diplomatic niceties that will have to be at play, I think those are not issues that are going to create some sort of a rancor in the meetings that happen. But I think US siding with India for that permanent seat at the UN Security Council definitely is headline number one. Headline number 2 is coming by way of this joint collaboration between the US and India, both on account of artificial intelligence, investments being made by US corporations in India, partnerships with Indian corporate houses to create this entire infrastructure ecosystem around artificial intelligence, backed by semiconductors, which power up this artificial intelligence revolution, is, I think, number 2 on the headline list. Now, add to this, of course, the entire trade deals which are getting signed between US and India. The seeds for this were also sown during Prime Minister Modi's visit to US in June. And finally, some sort of a clarity coming on the partnership between, let's say, the GE engines, which could be jointly developed, manufactured in India with Hindustan Aeronautics Limited, HAL, which would power up the Tejas aircraft. The Hunter drones, something that India has been vying for, asking for. We don't have indigenous drone development capabilities yet. So, you know, some sort of movement on that is something that, again, you know, the two countries decided upon and did go ahead with. So, I think broadly, these are areas of convergence right now. Areas of divergence would also surface. One, of course, being oil and oil import, right? Or trade settlement that India does in INR versus dollar.
Right.
Many experts say that is not on agenda. That is not on agenda. But you mentioned soft power. I think India will try to at least exercise soft power to influence some sort of discussion around trade settlement in INR. And it's not going to happen with US, it's unlikely to happen with UK or Germany, but at least the smaller countries, when we talk about their size of the economy and their contribution to world GDP, I think some of the smaller countries, we might be able to find some, you know, some headway when it comes to settling trade in INR.
And now, let's not forget import duty.
Import duty, yeah, again, I think, you know, we seem to have this reputation that India is high on taxes, India is high on excise and custom duties, import restrictions, on export restrictions. So again, I think it's important to see on the back of perhaps those IT restrictions that we had imposed on import of finished components or finished products of tablets, laptops, PCs. It didn't augur very well with the, you know, with the Western as well as neighboring countries that we happen to import from. But on the back of that, we are seeing some investment commitments being made by companies like Dixon and companies like Acer, which are likely to set up some sort of a plant, some sort of a manufacturing base here in India to advance their production. And that production is going to be relevant not just for India, but even for them to take advantage of everything that India offers with respect to labor, with respect to capital, with respect to the PLI scheme, take advantage of all these advantages that India offers and therefore use India as a manufacturing base to not just make in India to sell in India, but make in India to sell for the world. So I think these are some of the important influences that India will try to draw out of G20. But remember, G20 still happens to be largely, you know, more of diplomatic or diplomacy in the global economic order. And the number one agenda for the whole world, especially the emerging markets, is this whole reforms of the multilateral development banks, the MDBs. And that is something which I think India is trying to take or assert a leadership position on, that hey, we are the leaders of the global south, and whatever is happening with emerging markets when it comes to the debt burden on them and by way of restructuring that debt is something that India wants to fight on behalf of the emerging markets.
And that will be on the larger agenda, will be discussed over the course of next day and a half. But there will be a series of bilateral meetings, and what we have so far is that Prime Minister Modi will be meeting with leaders of the UK, Japan, Germany, Italy. There are, of course, a number of trade agreements that we have with these countries. Germany, of course, very solid trade agreements there with Germany as well, one of the largest, you know, trade partner of India. Those meetings could also result in substantial churning of trade. Remember, trade is one of the cornerstones of the G20 group. We want to have better trade ties, we want to have better policies, and this is a financial grouping. This essentially is a grouping of countries which wants to have better financial ties with one another. The larger expectations, and let's also understand what's going to be on the larger agenda, apart from talks around crypto regulation, and you briefly also touched on a possibility of MDBs, the multilateral development banks, there is a larger agenda at play, Krishna.
Well, there is definitely, and the grouping itself is based on the top 20 economies of the world. Let's get that straight over here. Economy sort of underlies this grouping in the first place. So definitely trade and economy will be a huge factor in these bilateral meetings. And look at the bilateral meetings. You name a country, all of them are countries which are great, which have been great in trade partners to India. Traditionally speaking, UK, Japan, Germany, these are some of the economies that India has been doing great trade with, exchange in terms of products, goods, services, all kinds of things. So the names of the countries you mentioned tells me that India is means business at G20.
All right, and apart from that, debt distress is also on the agenda, Karthik, and that is on the back of the fact that you want to help countries like Ghana, you want to help Sri Lanka restructure their debt, but in absence of Chinese leadership or Chinese premiership, it's going to be a little difficult.
Exactly. So I think this whole debate around the reforms in multilateral development banks stems from this whole need for relieving the debt distress in emerging economies and economies which are distressed for whatever reasons, internal or external. So the whole debate stems from this need of some North African countries as well as countries in the South Asian pack, which are burdened by a huge debt from these multilateral development banks. And parallelly, you mentioned China. There is this multilateralism with respect to these MDBs, 31 of them, versus unilateralism with China. So China, on its own accord, has pretty much acted in the capacity of these MDBs, giving these soft loans to these emerging economies which are distressed economies right now, and by way of lending to them, trying to take control of their economic assets, be it ports, be it mines, be it any other natural resources that those countries produce. I think China has been instrumental in adding to the debt distress in the emerging markets pack. And the unilateral banks not being able to either undercut China or extend and influence or sweeten the deal for these developing countries, more than what China is offering them. So this whole idea of reforming MDBs comes from this debt distress in emerging markets. Now, let's look at the IMF, for example. Now, US last week had pledged that it is going to invest about $25 billion. And $25 billion is a substantial number. $25 billion more in IMF and World Bank, or either of the two. Okay. So $25 billion coming from US. Other rich economies would also be compelled to swell up that kitty of multilateral development banks. But the issue being that these multilateral development banks are World War II era. They were developed in the 1940s, 1950s at Bretton Woods to help developing economies or underdeveloped economies back then by way of capital infusion for them to develop infrastructure, for them to develop educational institutions, healthcare institutions, etc. But needs of emerging markets today might be a little different.
Absolutely.
So you may have economies in in Africa, Ghana, Ethiopia, etc., which have infrastructure, basic infrastructure laid out, which have basic healthcare, basic education perhaps laid out, but the issue for them would be to let's say get the industry activated and use these investments to have a mining or a manufacturing based setup. Right. So the decision on where to use the money needs to be equally negotiated between the institutions which are lending to them and the countries which are receiving them.
Right. And perhaps not be used as perhaps a tool to control some of these institutions, or control rather some of these countries, which has been a concern especially for South Asian economies, where there's the debt seemed to be an instrument to control geopolitics. And since we have set the ball rolling on what could be and what perhaps is on the economic agenda, let's also Krishna, let's talk about the importance of G20 as a group. Let's talk about the importance of the top 8 countries for that matter, and let's pull up those graphics. We were trying to delve deeper into why this group is important, and has it been made redundant? Is it like a G7? Is it like a BRICS where whether you question you need it or not? Is it like an ASEAN? How is G20 better or different? And it's very surprising, the collective GDP of the top 8 countries of G20 is about 64% of the world GDP. So you're talking about a substantial share there, and India's share almost at 4%.
Right. And going back to the topic G20 that we're talking about, as I would like to reiterate, this grouping is based on economics. We're talking about the top 20 economies of the world. Now, for India and for India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi, this is the 3rd global fora that is being part of back to back. There was BRICS, there was ASEAN, now you have G20. And all three, Shweta, are different in their own way. BRICS is a grouping of countries and economies who have reached a certain stage of evolution in their economic growth. They have not fully achieved their potential, but they're still at a very high level in terms of their own evolution as an economy. So where India finds its place. And then you have ASEAN, where India is sort of a leader in the scheme of things, straightforward, because we're leading all these Asian economies. And then you have G20, which is the seat at the high table. And here we are at the master seat at the high table as the president of G20. So to me, this is how I would look at these 3 different global fora and India's place in them. And yes, all of it will mean that India has now go from G20 to be a member of the G7. All I'm looking forward to is that all this trade talk, defense ties pushes us in the fastest possible. I'm not putting a timeline on it. India should be a part of G7 and host its presidency next after this.
All right, and you can't put a timeline on it, basically, given the global economic volatility. And of course, we keep talking about the challenges to G20. Perhaps one of the biggest challenges to G20 would be inflation, would be problems around debt. And those will weigh in, and the uncertainty that persists, Krishna.
Even before that, Shweta, we don't have Russia and China, and we keep talking about the same thing, and they've been missing from global fora for the last 1 year, in one way or the other. Xi Jinping is there, there's no Putin. Putin is usually not there. There's too much, and consensus on which side are you going to take between other countries. Okay. You have a problem in the common statement in G20s these days because the Ukraine war has polarized global geopolitics and also divided straight down the middle. You have two sets of people taking sides in 2 different ways. So hence, these are uncertain times, and I reiterate the cliche, the VUCA world that we live in: volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. So in this time, at least for 20 nations to come together, to sit on one table and talk itself is a big deal, if you ask me. And these kind of issues will continue happening. But what I would like to see is how the global order gets redrawn. Okay. Like, for example, Karthik was talking about the fact that in the scheme of things, India has been sort of dehyphenating its ties beautifully. We're getting Russian oil, we have ties with Russia, we have ties with China, we have ties with the US. And in that sense, India is sort of doing something that's not being done before. And because of India's size, it is difficult to not look at what India is doing. And probably I would say the world should start taking lessons from India. If this is the size of your economy, if these are the number of people dependent upon you, you've got to get oil from one place or the other. You can't sit and play like, by principle, I'm not going to go here. By principle, I'm not going to go there. You've got to keep economies running. You've got to keep feeding people. You've got to keep roads.
And that has happened.
And that has happened. And that requires a very evolved way of approaching these global fora, these global groupings, as it were. So I think that we are in very, very times which we will become more clear forward when probably the Ukraine war ceases to exist. Then there's more normalcy and sanity in this global fora and global groupings, and greater consensus. When the lack of a greater consensus, the best you can do is what India has been doing. So if you ask me how these global forums work, you've got to take them with a pinch of salt. They've always been troubled by global factors, wars, difference. Imagine having these global forums during the Cold War days, or imagine having this during the Gulf War days. I'm sure none of them would have been simple. This is Ukraine war. Okay, the war has come to Europe finally, unlike the Gulf wars and other wars that have taken place in Asia.
All right, and in fact, live visuals coming in there from Bharat Mandapam at this point in time, where Prime Minister Modi is hosting a series of leaders as they enter, and the deliberations, of course, expected to start in just about an hour from now. now. Visuals, I mean, the look at the grandeur of it. I think that amazes me, notwithstanding that we've spent about 4,000 crore rupees to host that G20 summit. Some would say the money is worth spending, Karthik. You know, this is as big as it's going to be a show of display of India's grandeur, and also perhaps putting in place quick fixes to prepare Delhi to host these many people.
So, Shweta, you know, being a student of economics, I think it's important to look at the P&L. Right, and if you look at the P&L and if you look at the income statement, you know, anytime you host an event, there is going to be an expense that you incur. But then, what is the revenue that you're likely to draw on that event? So, I would look at this 4,000 crore rupees of investment. I would not look at it as an expense. I would actually look at it as an investment.
All right.
And this is an investment India is making in its future. Now, of course, the investment happens to be by way of red carpets and flags and you know, and hosting multiple global leaders. I believe over a lakh odd you know, number of international tourists or dignitaries are likely to be in India, and hosting them and putting up
this is the IMF chief, of course, walking in to meet Prime Minister Modi, Christina Georgieva. Well, interesting visuals of her dancing to that video yesterday when she was welcomed and grooving perhaps to the music. I don't know if we can pull that video, but it's doing the rounds on social media this morning. She's being greeted there by Prime Minister Modi. You know, talking about investments, yes.
Fascinating that, you know, you're talking about IMF, because, you know, we're talking about the multilateral development bank reforms, alternatives to the IMF and the World Bank. But there again, India is saying the fact that, no, we have no issues with the IMF and the World Bank existing. We're just saying that there need to be more of those things, and more of those things that serve the economies of Africa and Asia. There you go. I was just going to mention United Nations chief also in Friday, he landed here yesterday, UN chief Antonio Guterres. The moment he landed in India for the G20 summit, making it clear, whatever you do, all of you agree to 1.5 degrees, the climate protocol, the 1.5, the global temperature should not rise beyond 1.5 degrees. Every country has to commit to it. That's an important point that the UN chief made the moment he landed. I'm sure that's what he's looking at. We've been discussing so much of trade and defense. The other things which don't find, you know, enough of talk in other places. It's these global forums where you have to discuss things like climate change and what countries are doing to tackle climate change, because you can't wait for COP27s and COP28s to happen every single time. G20 forums, G7 forums, where all country leaders are together, are also great opportunities to discuss something like climate change. And with UN chief around, definitely that topic you know, remains as a top headline amongst other things.
So on climate change specifically, you know, again, Krishna, I think the battle has been
President of the World Bank, Ajay Banga, also walking in.
Another proud moment of India, you know, President of World Bank, an Indian, coming back to India for a G20 summit where India is the president of G20. Oh, goodness me. The symbolism is incredible.
And I think, again, somebody who has led a business like MasterCard in India for the longest time. This is definitely somebody who understands India's you know, financial prowess, understands the tryst that India has had with Jan Dhan and the tryst that India has had with digitization and fintech. So I think an important moment there for Ajay Banga to be back in India
as the president of the World Bank,
presiding over World Bank at a time when we are talking about debt restructuring, at a time when we are talking about multilateral development banks to be reformed. I think there is definitely one person sitting on that table who will understand where India is coming from, who will understand where emerging markets
and
are coming
from,
and what the challenges are. You know, I think despite leading an American multinational financial institution, credit card company in India, I think this is definitely somebody who understands what you know, what the challenges of debt can mean to emerging markets.
Right, more and more dignitaries.
More and more dignitaries coming and being greeted there by Prime Minister Modi himself. You know, we keep bringing you these visuals, of course. Proud moment for India.
Mr.
A lot of
Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, Director General of the World Health Organization.
Director General of the World Health Organization also walking in to be greeted by Prime Minister Modi.
Vishwa Swasth Sangh ke Mahanideshak.
And as these visuals continue to play up, and perhaps, since we were talking about...
As we speak, Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, the Director General of World Health Organization, who's made his way into the Bharat Mandapam. So, wishing him good luck for this G20 summit from our side.
Again, I think healthcare is something that again happens to be of great concern to emerging economies. I mean, we don't have social security. We don't have, the government fending for our ballooning bills when it comes to affordable healthcare. And affordable healthcare, again, is something that India has been trying to push. Affordable insurance, affordable healthcare. And these, of course, happen to be very, very important. OECD. Again, in the context of MDB's reforms and redevelopments. I mean, you've got to have sizable and reasonable investments in healthcare. And those can happen only if there is a corpus like the kinds controlled by World Bank, by WHO, by the UN, by the World Bank, when it comes to making sure that these investments actually translate down to the last mile, to the poorest of the poor in the emerging economies.
Absolutely.
And underdeveloped economies.
Just this morning, and since we're talking about healthcare, just this morning, and a lot of course, people who are also hoping that it's been about just 2 years since the pandemic hit India, and 2 years since we were making those frantic calls to, hospitals to perhaps get oxygen cylinders, and within just 2 years, India is spending a massive amount, of course, to host heads of states from 20 countries. A lot of people, of course, also critical of the amount of money that is being spent and worried as to what these investments are. But, as we continue to discuss details, a lot of leaders walking in there, states of head of states, as well as leaders of various agencies and financial institutions
Her
from
Excellency,
all across the world.
Ms. Nozi Okonjo Iweala, Director General of the World Trade Organization.
All right, DG,
there you go. We're talking
World
trade
Organization. I don't know if we have some of those graphics that we prepared on trade, because trade agreements, again, very interesting, very important to figure out the various trade agreements that could be arrived on the sidelines of the G20.
I'm just surprised that we have a bilateral with Italy. I'd be curious to know the kind of trade agreements that we end up, being able to sign with Italy. I can understand what we do with, say, Germany. Yeah, I'm curious to know what are the kind of partnerships, because look at some country like Italy, which took debt from China and was highly criticized by the rest of the European powers and the West for getting into the Chinese debt trap, and now they've cancelled that deal with China. They were distancing themselves from taking money from China. So I'm curious to know how India can move in and sort of partner with the Italian economy.
And chairperson of the African Union.
I mean, that's the battle that India is fighting, right? On
Absolutely,
behalf
and
of
fighting
the
for
African countries.
Yes.
Yeah, so we are fighting on behalf of African nations. See, I think it's important, if nothing else, at least the leadership that India is trying to take of the global south, and trying to be a statesman in that, and saying that, hey, we are all in it together. We have gone through this. We have gone through the pains of development. We have gone through the pangs of hunger, underdevelopment, and we are breaking those shackles now and emerging as a world part, the 5th largest economy, already slated to be the 3rd largest. And we know the pains of the underdeveloped economies, and we know how debt could hurt us and hurt you. So let's work on it together. So I think it's important to sort of look at it in that context. And add to that, of course, we were talking about the investments India is making, and we are talking about investments by way of hosting these G20 nations in India, and we were talking about free trade agreements. I think right now it is imperative for other European countries to seize this moment of signing FTAs with India rather than vice versa. I think it is in greater interest for Germany
His
right
Highness
now, which is degrowing,
Syed Asad bin Tariq
to find a way to have better trade ties with India, rather than India wanting to strengthen FTA. And you mentioned Italy. I think it's the case even with UK, pretty much with every European economy right now, because India is the fastest growing major economy. I mean, there is no other country which is, and ignore the data coming from China, and Chinese data is Chinese data at the end of the day. So a 6%, 6.4% growth rate in China has to be looked at with suspicion, given the ghost factories and given the zero COVID policy and the long lockdown which China emerged from just about 9 or 10 months ago. And look at the kind of sizable growth that India has made. I mean, upwards of 7%. You don't have any economy which is growing at that rate. Bangladesh,
Prime
again, of
Minister
course, a
Bangladesh.
very, very
People's Republic of
important
Bangladesh.
Right.
trade partner for India,
And one of the first
diplomatic partner
bilateral,
for
in
India.
fact,
one of the first-
conversations that Prime Minister Modi had before the
3
beginning
MOUs
of
have been signed
G20.
already with Bangladesh.
Absolutely, and India, of course, trying to keep its position intact as the voice of the global South, and all those initiatives, of course, being made by Prime Minister Modi there, hosting not just G20 countries, but also inviting a lot of countries which are significant and important trade allies of India from Southeast Asia. One country that wasn't invited, in fact, wanted to send its representation, was Ukraine. And we can't talk about G20 without talking about Ukraine, because we know a communique will be hard to arrive at without Chinese presence, without Russian presence. And Russia, of course, is going to be hard pressed at not having the word conflict be made a part of official communique that will come out of G20, Krishna.
Right, same problem at Bali as well. What is the wording of that final
His
communique?
Excellency, Mr.
so,
Abdel
those,
Fattah el-Sisi,
unfortunately,
President of
those
the
troubles,
Arab
the cloud of
Republic of
Ukraine
Egypt.
war will be present on this G20 summit as well. So that's exactly why arriving at a consensus on those issues, specifically the Ukraine war, I would say is next to impossible. To arrive at a consensus on which way we're going to go as a world, as a grouping. And even arrive at a final statement. So I don't expect anything different from the last Bali summit of G20 in this
And
summit.
India's made its position very clear. They said, okay, there may not be a final communique which everybody is going to agree on, but there has to be some communique that goes out. There has to be some consensus, and the consensus has to be largely around economy, financial policy issues, because that's the mandate of G20. So even if you don't agree on what the wordings will be around Russian-Ukrainian conflict, let's agree on other parameters. Let's agree on other recommendations that were made by the working groups, the B20, and a series of meetings that were happening, the FM Central Bank Governors meeting that were happening.
That's a good G20
three
president.
meetings.
That's
Absolutely.
a good G20 president. That's what you can do in a situation like this. They'll leave out Ukraine. Let's arrive at consensus on everything else apart from Ukraine. That's a smart move.
And that is what the G20 Sherpa, in fact, said in addressing the media yesterday, that there's going to be a host of issues where consensus will be arrived at. It may not be on the Russia-Ukraine
Kumar
issue.
Jagannath, Prime Minister of Mauritius.
I wonder what conversations on taxation havens and other things can take place with Mauritius.
And that is what Finance Minister also pointed out, right before G20, that there's going to be conversation also on rerouting of money, the tax havens, and that conversation perhaps would be important with Mauritius, which is a safe tax destination, as it would like to call itself. Perhaps also it's too safe for a lot of people who are trying to thwart and avert
in the
taxation
context
laws.
of tax havens, in the context of evasion of tax, it's important to look at the cryptocurrency debate as well. I think our quarrel with cryptocurrencies is to do with tax evasion, is to do with terror financing, is to do with the fact that international transactions can be made without leaving a trace.
His Excellency, Mr. Mark Rutte, the Prime Minister of the Kingdom of the Netherlands.
Another European power. Netherlands should be looking to do more with India than it has already been. So many Indians, Karthik, in recent times,
moving
moved to Europe,
absolutely.
moving to Netherlands because it's a great country to live and work in. Their Indian population has been steadily rising in the recent past. And Mark Rutte being here, like you were pointing out, Karthik, a lot of European powers should be looking at India and coming forward to strike as many deals as possible with India. It's in their interest more, as much in industries, if not more, in their interest, because degrowth in European economies, their economies are not growing the way they're supposed to. They're not even growing, they're growing backwards. So, and India is the fastest growing major economy. We love so many of things about Europe, because as culture, as produce, from cheese in Europe to wine in Europe to all other things that we love taking from Europe and becoming famous in India as we speak. Netherlands, Mark Rutte being here, I would also count amongst other economies that we discussed, the bigger ones like Germany and Spain and France for that matter. Netherlands is a very significant economy that India should learn to. It's a sea power. It has great advancements on sea. So number of cooperation is so high. I'm just hoping that something happens in Netherlands.
And talk about the startup culture. I think, the Netherlands, all of North Europe,
His
Sweden,
Excellency
Denmark, they've all been
Mr.
so
Bola
bullish on
Ahmed
startups in the fintech space, startups in the
of the
delivery
Federal
space. So I think there are great
Republic of
partnership
Nigeria.
opportunities with countries in North Europe.
Well, another country that perhaps India is looking to help in the longer run is, of course, Nigeria. And Nigeria, which is battling its own crisis with poverty, with hunger framework. During BRICS summit as well, India reiterated that it wants to help, African nations. It wants to help Nigeria. It wants to help Ghana. And in fact, just yesterday, after Finance Minister met with her US counterpart, she also met with Nigerian FM, where there was talks of extending a credit line to Nigeria if that is needed, perhaps also helping them with their debt management. All of that is going to be discussed further.
Talking about Nigeria, I should need to remind people that the largest economy in Africa is not South Africa, it is Nigeria. And Nigeria has English as the national language. So,
and the Prime Minister of Republic of Singapore there walking in to greet Prime Minister of
Singapore,
India,
which has just gotten a Tamil origin president.
And among the only 3 countries that India has actually opened its rice exports to.
Yep.
Because of the
special ties.
Yeah, special
and
ties.
It said so very
Mauritius,
categorically.
Singapore and Bhutan, if I'm not mistaken,
that is
being the
correct.
third. So
all the Tamils in Singapore need their rice, Karthik.
Yeah, and Singapore, of course, has a great number of Indians working there, making a living there, paying high taxes as well in Singapore.
Oh, yes.
But yeah, I think again, when we talk about services like UPI, export of UPI, countries where there is a sizable Indian population, where there is a sizable diaspora, are going to be early adopters of a service like UPI if it gets rolled out to the world. So we are talking to
Singapore
UAE already, we are talking to Singapore. And
in fact, it's happening as we speak.
Singapore and Dubai are 2 cities where I think UPI is already gone.
Already happening, or the Indians living there are already able to make transactions using UPI. With the partnership, as far as NPCI is concerned, has come through.
Calvino, first Vice President of the Government of Spain and the Minister for the Economy.
Right, another country I love, another economy that can do well with partnering with India, just like Italy, its neighboring economy. 2 ancient cultures, very similar to India in their love for food and culture. These are countries that should be looking. Italy should not be looking at China for partnerships. Italy should be looking at India for partnerships, and Spain.
Italy and Spain both battered during COVID.
Exactly.
Just see what happened to their economies during COVID, and it's going to take a long time, given the demographic disadvantage these countries have, to emerge out of that COVID-induced, hardship. So it is going to be a while before we see these economies coming back in the green and really being able to add not just to the world GDP, but even to their own existence. And that is where debt becomes important. I mean, if you have an aging population and if you are in a position where you don't have a demographic dividend like India or China, how do you get people to work? How much do you get them to work? And how do you pay them? And how do they pay taxes? And how does the wheel of the economy continue to roll? And that is something that, that the European nations will have to look at very seriously right now. So I think the challenge is as much on the emerging markets block as it is with these European economies, which are facing this challenge when it comes to to age not being in favor of their working population.
Fantastic point, Karthik, and that's another reason why they should be with India, because India has a demographic advantage, a young population in terms it can provide anything from
His
talent
Royal
to
Highness
market.
Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan, President of the United Arab Emirates.
And the President of United
How
Arab
can
Emirates,
we
let's
not
talk
discuss
about
the UAE and
you
stop
have
Europe for a bit.
Yes, UAE, another trade partner of India, where in 2022 India and UAE signed the CEPA agreement, the comprehensive trade agreement, eliminating trade barriers, reducing tariffs between the 2 countries drastically, post which the trade partnership has grown multifold. Some people also say it's grown by as much as 50%. The numbers are, of course, in the realm of speculation at the moment. But UAE, not just an important importer and exporter for India, but also an importer of oil. As India continues to be an importer of oil, UAE is emerging to be a more preferred destination, at least in the last couple of 2 months, as opposed to Russia.
For sure, Shweta. And I also see similarities when it comes to diversification of the economies. So UAE has also been for a long time working towards diversifying its economic interests beyond oil. And so is India. India is diversifying its economic capabilities beyond the services sector. And you see this diversification story playing out well between the two countries. Oil, of course, happens to be the largest trade link between India and the Middle East, and UAE playing a prominent role there. But beyond that, again, we were talking about UPI, and UAE being among the first countries to actually go ahead and install UPI as part of its financial inclusion ecosystem. So there's a great story of financial inclusion. There's a great story of import and export of currency and trade driven technologies, which is where UPI comes in squarely. And add to that this whole diversification that UAE is trying to do, given the fact that these countries also know that if the energy requirements of the world shift from non-renewable to renewable, they won't have much to talk about 20 years, 30 years from now. And all these countries need to hedge their own domestic interests. And if oil is something that will not have the kind of demand and will not command the kind of prices that it does right now, 10 years, 15 years from now, as electric mobility takes over, there's a problem for them.
Sanchez, Minister of the Economy of United Mexican States.
Well, talk about a global platform. We're going to keep taking flights from one region to the other. We took a flight from Europe to UAE, and now we're taking a flight from UAE
to New Mexico City.
To Mexico, in fact, not just New Mexico City, all Mexican states. Another economy which is not considered like a developed economy, but a developing economy, troubled by things that are similar to what troubles Indian economies and, for the matter, BRICS nations. So it'll be interesting to see what kind of a partnership that we can have with a country like Mexico. So many similarities as civilizations. Old. We're talking about the Incan civilization and the Mayan civilization, the Aztec civilization. Mexico has a very ancient civilization, just like India, was colonized by Spanish people, was called India, finally ended up with an English colonizer. But the same problems, great natural resources, original culture, music, food, Mexican food across the world, as famous as Indian food. So many similarities between Mexico and India, but curious to know what kind of partnership that we can have with Mexico, Shweta.
And look at the visuals coming. I think, it's important to add the kind of camera angles. We've seen over the last 2 years, even the Republic Day parades in India really evolve when it comes to, to the visual display. Using cameras, using technology. It's a delight. I mean, standing here looking at this frame, had you told me that this is a summit happening in, in any other developed country, I would not have challenged that claim. I mean, we know that this is happening in India, but where the gods are also kind, I think it's a nice cloudy day, but not raining right now.
That Nataraj statue, which was gotten in from Tamil Nadu, made in multiple pieces and assembled over here. Again, the symbolism, it is beautiful that the Bharata Mandapam truly ends up being representative of India as a nation, although it's there present only in Delhi. It's sort of, something for all Indians to connect with, and the beauty of Indian craftsmanship. Let's not forget, one of the oldest exports from India was India's craftsmanship, be it crafting diamonds or jewelry or statues. And bear in mind, Indian statues, these statues are extremely highly regarded and revered in the world, in the art world, and hence it's a good time for us to sort of hold this moment and take in that statue, because let's face it, there is also this huge statue smuggling business that goes around the world, and that's simply because of the beauty of the Indian craftsmanship, the rarity of Indian craftsmanship, the quality of Indian craftsmanship. So that being on display at the Bharata Mandapam as the dignitaries walk in, that's like reminding the world, hey, remember this? I'm sure you haven't forgotten this. This is what we were first famous for a long time ago. So that's what I think that statue would represent to all the global dignitaries who are walking in.
Right, a representation of India's people, its culture, and the Nataraj statue there. I think we got a long, sort of display of information information and a display of how much my colleague Krishna knows about the statue, that giant Nataraj statue which is outside Bharat Mandapam, installed and brought in from Tamil Nadu. All right, and since we continue to talk and as more and more leaders arrive, let's come back to a serious conversation that we were having by the way of what's going to come through after this summit, the summit which will conclude tomorrow afternoon. It's going to be an action-packed day today up until tomorrow afternoon, post which India is going to hand over the baton of G20 presidency to Brazil. So it's going to be Bali, then India, and now Brazil, which is where it's going to happen next year. All of this culminates into a long list of items which are on the agenda, and I think a final declaration, a final communique is what we were discussing, Krishna, and it's going to be a difficult communique to arrive at, as I said, because of the obvious absence of Xi Jinping, as well as Mr. Putin, who made it clear that he's not going to be making it through to the event, and also extended his greetings, also congratulated India and showed confidence in India's presidency, except showing.
I think, technically it's not possible for him to show up if he's on the International Criminal Court.
No, I'm not blaming him for it.
How does he step out of his country? I mean, he can't risk getting arrested in the middle of a war that he has initiated unprovoked. And continues to wager on a year and a half into the war. I mean, and it's not that
and India officially also disagrees with that. India on an official line, India says that we have got nothing to do with the ongoing conflict.
Fernandez,
calling it a conflict, by the way.
President of Argentina.
All right, and that's of course President of Argentina walking into the Bharat Mandapam. But India's official stance, and G20 Sherpa Amitabh Kant made it very clear: we have nothing to do with the ongoing conflict. What we care about is our people. We care about
our economic interests. I think it is as simple as that.
And we would like to be non-partisan. We would like to continue to sit on the fences. We don't want to be a participant to what's happening, as far as this geopolitical interest and interest of Western economies. Because even, in fact, just yesterday, after meeting with Indian Finance Minister Janet Yellen, also spoke about why helping Ukraine is going to be a top priority for Western economies.
I mean, the Western economies obviously want to stand up to this regional bully called Russia. I think there is absolutely no doubt that if this war were to ever end, we know where the Western world's interests and allegiances lie.
Right.
So it is fairly obvious.
Mr. Anthony Albanese, the Prime Minister of Australia.
Oh, the far end of the world from where Mr. Albanese has come, Australia. The one country, Shweta, that we actually have a free trade agreement with, that is signed, sealed and delivered. So bear in mind, when you look at Mr. Albanese, all that Indians have to think about at least is that, hey, one important developed country, might not be the biggest by any stretch of imagination, but definitely a country where there's so many Indians, so much of exchange of people and other things, English-speaking country, that so many Indians emigrating to. Having a good deal, a free trade agreement with Australia is very important. I'm very glad that India has managed to finalize that, but I really hope when we look at Australia, India is reminded about the fact that we need to finalize that with the US and the UK.
Yeah, and I think the next big event at a global stature is going to be the Quad Summit next year. And India, Australia, both sort of being great partners of the Quad ecosystem as well. And Justin Trudeau there.
His Excellency Mr. Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister of Canada.
It's been difficult relationship with Canada of late, with a lot of chatter and talks, of course, of Canadian administration trying to protect pro-Khalistani elements, and as a result of which we've seen at least the relationship taking a beating, at least not officially, but the optics of it looks like it has taken a beating of late.
Definitely, in the recent past, definitely that has been a big bone of contention, between India and Canada. But every time that happened, all I could think of was that how many Indians live in Canada? How many Indians still want to go to Canada? How much trade happens between India and Canada, traditionally speaking, how much it can be taken forward. They need human resources, they need, they don't have the population to sort of expand what they are doing. So that's the reason why they look for people to emigrate, to come to Canada and take up some of the jobs over there. Indians have been a great, important player in developing Canada
Absolutely.
itself. So, same way you don't want a Ukraine war sort of, destabilizing equations across the world. You can't have one Khalistan issue that destabilizes other good things that happen between India and
I
Canada.
think India has made it very clear that we will not tolerate Khalistani voices coming out of Canada and trying to, question India's
but I'm only thinking
sovereignty, and you're thinking economics, and
we
hope that
enough.
Geopolitics will not overshadow economic relationships between the two countries.
Her Excellency Ms. Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Commission.
And that is the President of the European Commission walking in to be greeted by the Prime Minister. European Commission, of course,
the
the
battles
trade,
that
the battles, that their own battles
with the big
are
tech
absolutely.
out there. I think that's a whole new debate which I don't think the G20 will be able to participate in or influence in New Delhi. But I think European Trade Commission literally at loggerheads with Alphabet, with Meta,
His
with
Excellency
practically
penalized
every
them.
big tech company out there. I think data
President of the
security
European
is
Council.
something which is absolutely a concern, not just to the European Trade Commission or the European region, but
now
to
even India.
I think
Absolutely.
even India, and the fact that that data privacy, data security, we've passed the DPDP, right, the Digital Data Protection Bill, and heavy penalty there. Likely to be imposed on any case of data being infringed or transmitted, by the holders or the owners of the data to a third party. So I think India is also moving in that direction of data privacy. But government again having a complete right over every piece of data emerging from India is a concern. And when we talk about these large investments being made in data centers in India, and these bills that we are trying to enact by way of, again, the DPDP as well as the Digital India bill, which is likely to be tabled in the winter session of the Parliament, I think we may run into some challenges with companies and countries that we are importing technology from or partnering with when it comes to creation of data centers, creation of semiconductors, manufacturing of AI-based architecture.
Right.
All of that will need data to operate, and that data protection.
We want to house
is
that
going
data in India,
and
we're
not
building
just
capacity for that. Reliance is doing it. It's partnering with global companies to do it. So essentially, the idea is to keep Indian data within the Indian shores, within the Indian borders.
His Excellency Mr. Olaf Scholz, Chancellor of Germany.
Mr. Olaf Scholz, His Excellency Olaf Scholz, being in India, Germany, a huge trading partner, and as Karthik has been saying all this while, Germany should be coming towards India, with especially keeping in mind what is happening with its economy, the degrowth in its economy, and
technically the first country to hit recession.
To witness a degrowth.
Two quarters of degrowth,
Continuous
and that
degrowth.
continues into the third quarter as well. I think one country which
the biggest economy of Europe.
The biggest economy of Europe, and the first one to enter technical recession at a time when we were talking about the US heading towards recession. And
Germany beat US
UK and UK heading towards recession. I think Germany really facing a difficult challenge right now of keeping its economy afloat, and there is absolutely a great need for investments to go into Germany, and the fact that it will have to come out of the shackles of recession. Given the fact that there are so many auto brands that that come out of Germany, and India being, of course, selling luxury cars like no tomorrow. I think we have enough and more Indians buying the Mercedes and the BMWs and the Audis and the Volkswagens
And the Volkswagens
and the Volvos.
German brands are in competition with themselves in India.
It's interesting the way you put it.
But Volvo is from Sweden, but you've got Mercedes, you've got BMW. I mean, iconic German brands, and Indians, when it comes to luxury cars, without debate or discussion, fundamentally go straight towards a German brand.
Absolutely.
Trusted, reliable,
Expensive.
and expensive.
It's
of
luxury
course,
cars,
with trusted
You want other things,
reliability
you try
comes
South Korean
expense.
cars. You want regular.
And Chinese cars. Would you like some Chinese
I don't
cars,
think government
perhaps?
of India will let me buy Chinese cars in India.
Good
Look at what is
point,
happening
good
with MG. Look at what is happening with BYD. But yeah, I think coming back to Germany, the interesting story from Volkswagen there comes from the fact that even Indian companies like Mahindra and Mahindra are dipping into this open ecosystem that Volkswagen has been able to create when it comes to components and parts that go into electric vehicles, electric mobility. And I think there is a very clear-cut target of all luxury brands in Germany to have 70 to 80% of their fleet being all electric by the turn of the decade.
And it's interesting because they're importing the same philosophy here in India. Just yesterday, I was reading about Mercedes' plans to have at least one of every 2 vehicles they sell in India by 2030 to be an electric car. So they're the same philosophy of they're hoping to also apply in India. And you know, since we keep talking about electric vehicles, perhaps more and more German companies are bringing in their electric vehicle philosophy to India, which augurs well for us and is in line with our own expectations of an electric fleet,
and
a 50% electric
you know, I
fleet.
think when it comes to technology,
Miss Giorgia
Nothing beats Germany.
Meloni, Prime Minister of Italy.
There you go.
The
Giorgia
Italian
Meloni,
Prime
Prime Minister of
Minister.
Italy. I want to know what kind of pizza partnerships we can have with them. Because it's really important. Again, the similarities between Italy and India as a country. Ancient cultures, their food is world
The
over
language,
famous.
the culture.
Language,
absolutely.
people who are passionate about their language, people are passionate about their culture, people are passionate about their economy doing well. And that's the reason why, you know, after a particular stage, they even went to China to improve their economy. But that didn't work out. So there's a space over there where India can jump in. And to start with, for Indian tourists wanting to go to Spain, and even for that matter, Italy, you know, there are no direct flights. I think maybe first thing we can start discussing with Giorgia Meloni is how soon we can have direct flights instead of having to take a flight to whichever carrier you're using and having a stopover and then going to Italy/Spain. So I think we used to have direct flights to Milan once upon a time, and I think Air India
Air Italia used to fly
used to
direct
operate
Delhi
but
to
now
Milan.
Air India, the newly revamped Air India, has said that there's going to be direct flights to Milan. So
Hopefully.
fingers crossed. So, and
His Excellency Mr. Fumio Kishida, Prime Minister of Japan.
But the Prime Minister of Japan also walking in, and with Japan, of course, we have important ties. Important ties, by the way, of you know, a trade agreement that we have with Japan that I'm hoping we'll push out the details of. But Japanese culture, I mean, since we're trying to find similarities, I think a dissimilarity between Japan and India, it's the demographic dividend that India has and Japan does not, and it continues to struggle and has put measures in place to ensure there is more people giving birth. They are not trying to just aid and abet that, but also hoping that there'll be a younger population that will be able to take reins, economic reins back.
absolutely, then there's no similarity this time around. Everything is an opposite. Japan is a country of one language. And you know, and Japan has got a very unique history in terms of, and also it's because of its topography. It is constantly susceptible to tsunamis, to earthquakes, to all kinds of natural disasters. That has sort of shaped that culture. It's a stoic culture. They've seen Hiroshima, Nagasaki. You know, this is a culture and country very different to that of India. But the ties between India and Japan are as old as the hills. So you know, Japan as a country, you know, is very important to India today, and as Karthik was mentioning, part of the Quad. We are a part of the Quad with Japan and the US and Australia. So, you know, another important trading / defense partner when it comes to protecting the Indian Ocean, Karthik.
Absolutely, and add to that, of course, you know, you have Japanese automobile companies again in India. You've got Honda, you've got
His
Suzuki,
Excellency
the Maruti
Mr. Yoon
Suzuki
Partnership.
President of the Republic of Korea.
Another car maker. Every time we look at a premier these days, we're always thinking car makers over here. Japan, of course, there's Toyota, Suzuki in India. Korean cars, the kind of growth they've witnessed in the last couple of years, you know, especially a brand like Kia, an iconic Korean maker. And of course, it's a country that has hosted Hyundai for 3 decades now. So great trading partners.
Since we are talking about Korea, let's not forget their culture, the K-pop, and the dramas in which you know Netflix is heavily investing. You've got Indians watching K-dramas extensively. Their cosmetic industry, which is as big as it gets, bigger than anybody in the country, in the world.
And even Innisfree fan. I'm an Innisfree fan, one of the famous Korean brands in India.
Absolutely, and you know, Korea, they're leading the game as far as drama is concerned. Their cultural heritage that they're showcasing to the world by the way of indigenously made movies, shows, dramas that are up for grabs, not just by India and in a population here in India, but by world. And Netflix also targeting Korea in a big way.
I think this whole democratization of content discovery, which is happening on OTT, 5 years
Surprising and
ago,
wonderful.
you know, how many Indians would have even heard of a Korean drama or K-pop? And this whole democratization of content which is happening, of content discovery through OTT, I think is a great story in itself to tell and to watch unfold right in front of our eyes. Because you've got in the same you know, breath, if I can draw parallels with South Indian cinema finding a market across the world. You know, it's not just about a mainstream India equal to Bollywood or South India making it to North India. No, I think that era is long over. We are actually looking at South Indian, South Korean, South everything, you know, the global South becoming a global entertainment.
Usually the term going down south is a bad term.
President of the Republic of South Africa.
But not
South Africa now, from South Korea to South India to South Africa now. And the term South, Karthik, in English, for example, I don't know why the people who came up with the English language used the term things went south in a negative way.
As if in a bad way.
We need to redo that and go, things going south is actually fantastic.
Okay.
I think
so perhaps the
simple
negative
logic,
connotation
Krishna,
to
simple logic being that the maps always were drawn 2D. And on 2D you had north on top and south at the bottom. So hence north and south. Our friend Amit often says that, hey, north of this, north of that, you know. I think it's just visually when you see the map, you see that south is the bottom part of the hemisphere.
And nobody wants to be at the bottom.
Nobody wants to be at the bottom.
And while the banter between the two of you continues, I'm going to hand over.
Shweta, that's not fair. I thought you were making sense.
I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Kabir, who's just walking into the studio at this point.
Re-elected President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who has just walked in to the Bharat Mandapam in India. Turkey and India also ancient civilizations, ancient partners, business partners. Here's wishing Recep Tayyip Erdogan all the best.
Mr. Recep Tayyip Erdogan, President of the Republic of Turkey.
President of Turkey, President Erdogan, making his way to shake hands with the Prime Minister in front of the iconic replica of the Konark wheel, something that has been taken in our tricolor as well. The Prime Minister was expected to address the member nations at the inaugural session, the opening day of the G20 summit at the Bharat Mandapam. That's the President of Turkey, President Erdogan, shaking his hands with the Prime Minister of India, under whose presidency the G20 summit is being held and hosted here in the national capital. Earlier, we saw leaders from South Africa, leaders from Italy, leaders from Japan, from South Korea, you name it. And right there on your screens, ladies and gentlemen, that you can see.
Rishi Sunak, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom.
Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Rishi Sunak. Yesterday, a lot of visuals of him stepping down, off the Royal British Air Force's, plane, with that picture of him with his spouse, fixing Rishi Sunak's tie, with various captions that are now doing rounds as memes on the internet, saying that, I'm going to meet my in-laws. Am I looking fine? Also, sporting that orange color tie yesterday, talking about